All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jackie Adams, and I have the privilege and the honor of hosting a conversation with Anila Quayyum Agha here at the Columbia Museum of Art. We're opening your exhibition tonight, and we're so excited. Thank you all for being here and spending some time with us. I've really had a good time getting to know Anila. It's been a long process of putting the show together, but I've come to realize that you and I have a little bit more in common than I realized. So we've been spending some time together, getting to know each other, and just having some of those commonalities has been a wonderful way to kind of get deeper into your work.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
Yes, yes. So what we're going to do, before we get started, I'm just going to point out one thing. As you listen to the conversation tonight, you're going to see behind me a loop of some images on our screens. These are just some samples of Anila's work. And I would welcome you to rest your eyes on some of those examples as we have conversation. We may talk indirectly or directly about some of the pieces that you see behind us, but it's a good way to get a great sampling of her artwork. So, how's that sound?
Sounds wonderful. Thank you.
All right. Well, Anila, again, it's wonderful to have you here. Wonderful.
Well, I am so grateful, and thank you for everybody who's come out to hear our conversation, and also the people who came or traveled from Augusta that I've just recently gotten to know. So thank you so much.
Yeah. We're very fortunate that your exhibition overlaps with your time here in Augusta. So when we found that out, we were super excited because we knew that you were going to be here in person. So we're planning a couple field trips to come and see you actually in Augusta as well. So,
and I'm really excited or scared.
So I thought what we could do is first to kind of start from a place of getting to know your background a little bit. You and I both share an immigrant story. We're both immigrants to the United States, and we came under different circumstances. We both have textile in our backgrounds, and I just would love for our audience to know a little bit more about your own personal history, because so much of your journey from Pakistan to here is really seen in your work in so many ways, layers and layers of it. And I think it will start to open up to the audience really where your concepts are coming from.
So that's a really broad question.
I know. Life story.
I think much of my work comes from my experiences and the way I navigate the world. And the world is fractious a lot of the times. And I've seen a lot of political upheavals, both in Pakistan and in the United States now. And so a lot of the work that I am compelled to make is about the social conditions that affect all of us. And, I think, and I read this somewhere, but I also am I don't remember who said it, but I think that it's really important as an artist to reflect what's happening around us. And so since the time that I was in art school to the time now, when I am an older person, I realized that politics is like the integral thing to my work, because politics affects community, and politics affects everything that we are and we do. And somehow I want to be almost like the person who makes people see what's happening around us, but also have a moment of reflection, but also have a moment of hope that we will get through the hard times, which is why we came up with the title, Let a Million Flowers Bloom, because I think it is so important, especially after the pandemic, to have a sense of hope and build community again and bring people out. But I think it goes back to the time when I was growing up as a child. My mother was very into having sewing circles in our home. I was very young. I remember kind of hanging around and listening to all these women who would come from the neighborhood, and they would build these quilts, and I would sleep under it, or I would just listen to them. I was very inquisitive even then. And so I spent a lot of time listening to these women talk about their lives, and I think that made a really deep impact on me, because I felt the inequity between the genders even at the age of 5 and onwards. And in South Asia, there's a lot of inequity between the genders. And so when I moved to the United States, and before you ask, I moved because I was totally bored in Pakistan. And it was because I'd kind of hit the glass ceiling and I couldn't go beyond. And so when my husband of that time, this is my second husband who's, working with me now, but he suggested we come to the US. I was like, oh, wow, it's a new challenge. Let's go do it. I wonder if I'd say the same thing if I knew what I know now.
It was all,
a plan.
Yes. And from a distance, I would think that the United States was a huge curiosity for you.
It was, because, the only real knowledge of the US was through Hollywood films for us and the music. And I remember my oldest sister was totally obsessed with Michael Jackson and his album that came out where he's doing that moonwalk.
Yes. Thriller, maybe? Thriller, yeah.
Yes. And so we only knew the US through the Hollywood films. And from that point of view, it seemed like it was a fabled land where people lived free, they did what they needed to do, and they never had to kind of deny their identity or anything like that. And so once I moved here, the first few years, I kind of realized that it may not be absolutely true what Hollywood depicts. But it took me 21 years of living here in the United States to realize that this country is very similar to Pakistan, politically. Politics, I think the only people who benefit are the politicians, personally. And so I have spent a lot of time understanding the Constitution here and educating myself about why we keep going back to this racial question and gender question and things like that. And I think that is very integral to my work, because as a displaced person here in the United States, but also as a woman in Pakistan, I was discriminated against. And so that, of course, you see in my work if you want to, because I don't like to punch people in the face. I want to make them think and reflect through my work. And so I'm never going to put something that out there that's not going to have layers to it, where if you're interested, you can spend the time to look it up or understand or think and kind of come to a conclusion yourself. I think artwork that tells you exactly what to think is often, I find, boring. So I want to make it so that you have to excavate or research or look deeper into yourself, but also into your community to understand what the work is about. And so I think part of it is from Pakistan and the way I grew up, and part of it is from here. So it's a combination of having lived in two different spaces, two different countries that are very different from each other, yet extremely similar.
Yes.
In many ways.
Yeah, I think one thing that I picked up on with your work is there are always these layers of contrast happening in your work. And specifically when you go to All the Flowers Are For Me, when you see that piece, you have such a visceral response to it. It's really just a mesmerizing, captivating piece. But I want to go back to something that you said earlier about the mosques in Pakistan and how there are real delineations. And in the statement on the wall, it talks a little bit about the roles that women played in domesticity and nature versus men's roles in Pakistan. And so all of that is infused in that work. Can you elaborate a little bit more on some of those ideas in terms of that work in particular? Because it does have that mosque-like quality to it when you go in, but you realize it's not that religious structure at the same time. So you feel like I kind of know this, but I kind of don't as well.
So all the flowers are for me. I kind of built it for myself. Because I thought to myself, for the longest time, if you look at history of the world and history of humanity, somehow women have given birth, they've managed families, they kind of run, they are the fabric of society. And yet, often in various places around the world, they're undervalued. Yet, the ability to give birth is a big deal. And so how come we reduce that to being almost unimportant? And then that was the first thought. And then secondly, I thought to myself, it's really interesting that, in Pakistan where I grew up, being in public space was extremely difficult for a young woman. Whether you were pretty or not, it didn't matter. You were just in public space, and your bubble was often pierced by men who would grab your ass or pinch you or do something that was inappropriate. And so I often think, and I don't know if this happens in other places, I've traveled in India, I've traveled in other places, and I think that maybe the access to women's bodies may differ in different societies and different cultures, but it's often the lascivious gaze that men have towards women that create this problem. And because of that, the Islamic culture or the Muslim culture in South Asia has almost made it culturally difficult for women to pray in a mosque. Their men don't want them to go out in public because they're going to be molested. That's the understanding. So religiously, it's not denied to women to pray in a mosque, but culturally, it's denied to women to go to public spaces. And a public space like a mosque, where a mosque is not just the repository of prayer, it's the library, it's the cultural center, it's where people have their weddings and their, everything. It's the hub of their environment. And women are denied that space. So when I was thinking of making this work, I was thinking of, women have reclaimed the natural world through artifice, like the carpet, like the curtains, the wallpaper, the things that they bring inside the spaces that are considered to be female spaces. And so that was the impetus to make that work, because I was really interested in creating a space that was a healing space, but it didn't bar men or other gendered people from coming in, but it was also a welcoming space for women themselves. So it's an open space for everybody, regardless of whether you have religious dogma or cultural issues or social issues or religious issues. It doesn't matter. It's an open healing space for everybody to participate in.
I just had this thought, because that must be an extremely powerful thing for you to experience with your artwork, that when you're in that space and you bring visitors in, you have the ability to break through those barriers just by the sheer nature of the work that you do. Has that struck you in any type of way? That
Oh
that
my
idea is
God, the
not
weight
lost
of it
on
is
you?
so hard.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of beautiful when you just talk about what you were saying, and that now there is this welcoming space where those cultural barriers that you talk about are no longer there.
It's also a metaphor for building community between genders, between religious communities, between everybody. Because, how do we bridge the divisiveness that we are facing currently in our present times? People will always think differently from each other. But we have to find some common ground to be able to find things that are common rather than just different. And commonalities can make such an impact on people. Like when you actually start talking to everybody, and they may be Republican or Democrats, they may be Jewish or Muslim or Christian or Muslim, it doesn't really matter. I think underneath it all, we are all human, and we look for the same things: refuge, education, well-being of our kids, and a good life.
I sort of get lost when you talk about that idea, and I see your work and the patterning. You sort of get lost in that notion when you look at the patterning of your work. And you've told me that when I first saw your work, I thought, oh, she must be very religious. But you said to me, no, I'm not. But there's obvious connections there to the Quran and patterns that have come from the Quran. And you talk about a stand that you grew up with that the Quran was placed on. And I just, I love that notion that the patterns in your work and how fluid they are and how connected they are, but also how they delineate things too. Can you talk a little bit about how patterning has been a big part of your work and where you have looked to in Persian, Turkish, Indian installments, and just where that comes in, because it's just such a dominant design element in your work. And I would love to hear more about that.
So if you think about it, like, in this century has allowed something to happen that's different from what was happening in the 20th century. Like when I was going to grad school, often I was told, you can make beautiful things. And I was critiqued during grad school quite often that my work and my craftsmanship was too good, that I made things too beautiful. And so I often thought about it, like thinking, okay, so that was Euro-Western viewpoint of beauty, that it's banal and, it doesn't carry any meaning, and a beautiful person doesn't reflect the personality and stuff like that. And all that is true, yet the Eastern philosophy is slightly different from that aspect. It's about, like viewing nature as something that you need to live in harmony with. And I think the Western concept is to conquer nature. The Eastern concept is to live with it, at least as far as I know. And I'm not an historian, so I may not be able to speak more about that, but that's my understanding. And so I often think about, how do I bring the peacefulness, the beauty that is surrounding us, and reflect on how we are destroying it. And so that's a very integral part of my work, because I think I'm really quite worried about how climate change is going to affect people again from the same places that have already suffered way too much during colonization, during imperialization. Like our history is full of it. World history is full of it. And so if we continue to do this, who are the people that are going to be affected? The black and brown bodies are going to again suffer the same issues that they've already gone through for centuries. So when do we say it's enough? And so I want to create the work in such a way that it makes you look at the beautiful and think about what we are going to miss when it's gone. So that's one of the issues. Then I also think about the idea of how do I draw people in? Because, when you're looking at a sunset, you're drawn in, regardless. It's natural, it's around you, and it's abundant, but it's fleeting. And how do I make that happen through my work? So the work is not fleeting, it's extremely solid. Yet it has this fragility to it that makes you think that it's really light as air, but it's not. If somebody laid down and fell on them, it'll be toast.
I tell everyone.
That body.
I say that cube is 500 pounds. Don't lay under it. Be very careful. It's a heavy piece of sculpture.
So I think sometimes I wonder about, how do you convince people that life is valuable and anybody's life is valuable? And so that's what I try to do. Secondly, I think it was also when I was going to grad school and I was dissuaded from doing the work that I wanted to do quite often. I wanted to kind of make my colleagues and my professors a little more knowledgeable about South Asia, because in my faculty that I was studying with, there was only one black person, and she was from the US. And so there was limited understanding of what South Asia means. And in any case, nobody admitted to the fact that there's a South Asia. They all thought I was Middle Eastern. And Asian people are from the Far East. And I'm like, but that continent is humongous. And, so it became my desire to educate the people that I was going to school with, to make them aware that, my history is not just Pakistan. It's deep. Indus Valley is older than Egyptian civilization. So you need to understand where I'm coming from and what I want to do with my work. It's not just limited to a gimmick. It's about creating understanding. And I think that has stayed true throughout my work. I want to keep doing it. And that's why I'm an educator too, because I want to connect people. I want to create community. I want to educate them so they are not unaware of a bigger world out there. The US is surrounded by oceans on either side. And so often, it's a giant island, right? But there's maybe not enough understanding about the rest of the world and how if a bird flies in the US, it affects somebody in Korea. Or, And so I think I'm very concerned about the world. And it weighs on me. And I continuously educate myself about the racial situation that exists in the United States. Because when I came here, I was a Pakistani person. I didn't realize I was brown until I got here. I didn't know that I was the other until somebody discriminated against me.
Right.
And so those things have taught me that there must be other people out there who are feeling the same thing.
Absolutely.
And it makes me worried for our future. How do we survive this?
When I...
And I don't know if I answered your question.
No.
Because I went all over.
No, I think that's wonderful. I had a lot of thoughts. I was like, I wonder if she considers herself an activist artist now, because aligning that with politics and how politics impact us in so many ways. So that was another thought that I was having. But your shadow play. So all of that made me think of your shadow play. As an immigrant, shadows are an interesting metaphor because there are so many nuances when you go to another country. When a light gets cast on you, you feel like you have to be something else, or you have to start changing shades of who you are as an immigrant. So I am curious about the shadow play in your work, because from my lens, I got it very immediately. I was like, oh, this visually it tells exactly how I feel on most days with my experience as an immigrant. But I wondered when did you start to invoke light into your work and then start to see those shadows come about? And how did that all come about, that discovery of the shadows, or of the light and then the shadows?
So, I can't take credit for the shadow play completely on my own, because I think there were many, many things that happened throughout my life that brought me to this moment of like combining my artwork with light and shadow. So there's a place in Lahore where I grew up, and it's a mausoleum for one of the kings of India, who so it's sort of like a beautiful place. The king is buried in there, but it's also humongous, and there are beautifully laid out gardens around it. And because the river that flew through the city of Lahore at one time, but then changed its course, it's become like a forgotten place. And as art students, we were taken there constantly, because it was this place that was so quiet that you could hear your thoughts talk to you. It was that kind of quiet. You could hear the silence. And in that place, they had these marble screens that are very, common to the architecture of South Asia and Central Asia, that you find carvings inside marble. So it was a way to bring light and air through an extremely hot environment into the buildings. And the walls are made of bricks that are like at least 2 feet thick. So it's always cool on the inside, yet the breeze flows through. So I was familiar with the screens for a very long time. Since I was like maybe 12, I'd been going to these places. And so when I moved to the US, I was doing work that in graduate school, I was doing cutouts by hand, and I was stitching the edges with thread, because again, my mother's sewing circle often, showed up somehow, left or right shoulder. And so I started combining pattern and those screens idea, and then I would put those drawings in shadow boxes, so the reflected light would shine inside and cast shadows on the inside of those cutouts. And then I had the experience of visiting the Alhambra in southern Spain, where the Moors had built the Alhambra. So just to clarify, the Alhambra is not a mosque. It's actually a palace that the Moorish kings lived in, because they owned a part of Spain. And it's just a wonderful place to visit, because once I arrived there, I think I was also hungry, because I had to, they have appointments set. You can't just walk through it, trample through it. It's a World Heritage Site. And so I had to show up for my appointment, and I was getting late. So it's also on a hill. And so I didn't eat lunch, and I was a little lightheaded. And so when I showed up, I'm walking through this beautiful complex, I'm like thinking, I have arrived in the heaven of pattern. There was tile on the floor, there was mosaics on the walls, there was cutouts in the wooden ceilings, and everybody who's walking through, and there were hundreds of people walking through, mostly European, and they're all talking in whispers. And so it occurred to me at that point in time that, I want to make work that makes people look like that and talk like that, because it makes them compassionate. It makes them want to talk to a stranger without having to be introduced. It I saw people talking to me. I mean, usually I am often left out of a conversation because I'm foreign. I speak with an accent, and people, find it difficult. So and my name is difficult. So I often feel like I am left out of a conversation. But there, because of the way the environment was, everybody was talking to everybody else in whispers. And so all those things kind of became like a catalyst. When I got back to Indiana, I started cutting out the patterns that I'd taken photographs of. And then as I'm looking at it and I'm raising it, the light from above kind of filtered through, and I thought, God damn, this is what I need to do. So I just started, immediately I applied for a grant. I got a large sum of money from my previous university, and I was able to build the first cube. And at that time, I was also thinking about the idea of what the cube in Saudi Arabia does for the Muslim community. And I mean, this is a personal thing, and I don't mean to offend anybody, but I think that sometimes religious institutions can dominate and repress people. Women in the East have often been repressed, and I am a product of that. So to my mind, I was gonna raise the cube and levitate it so it became light.
Okay.
And it had this fragility, and the light is emanating out of it, but it's beautiful patterns that are often associated with women. Because women make pretty things, and they make textiles, and it's not fine art. And so my thought was to kind of turn the tables on that idea and create work that is really stunningly beautiful, that it'll bring a tear to your eyes, make you compassionate, or at least allow you to feel emotional, so that you can kind of feel somebody else's pain and realize that, we are no different than others. And so it kind of happened almost like, I've lived here for 21 years now. This is my 22nd year in the US. And now I'm thinking, like, I understand, but the South is teaching me again.
I know this is, and for some who may not know, this is your first time in the South.
Well, I lived in Texas, so, but that's a different country.
Yeah, we were saying, it's kind of like Florida. Florida's not in the South. But yeah, your experiences thus far in the South. You've been here for just a short time. I think it's been less than a year.
2 years, actually, but because of the pandemic, it feels like it's only been 6 months.
Yeah, the pandemic is, it is. I'm wondering, as you've spent time in the South, because the South has a strong textile tradition as well, have you discovered anything in the South, whether it be the textiles or the culture, that you're starting to pick up on a little bit in terms of, you've lived in many different places, and all of this has had some influence on your work. Are there any characteristics that you're finding in the South that is starting to resonate that way for you?
I love the flora and fauna here. It's just beautiful. It's so lush. The water, the rain makes everything lush. And it's just stunning, and the greenery and the different greens. And so in the last 2 years, I've been doing a lot of collage work. But because I also have multiple shows that are forthcoming, I have to prepare work for that too. So that's sort of like taking a slower turnaround. It's also slightly or quite a lot different than what you see on the screens on either side. And I'm like, I don't know if I'm ready to show that work yet. But it's also been my experience that the first few pieces are often shit anyway.
Oh, yeah. We have been there.
So I have to continue to explore it, and eventually something interesting would happen, and I'd be able to kind of combine my heritage with the work or the inspirations I'm finding in the South. I love the expression, bless her heart. I think in a way it's kind of sweet, but in a way it's also very sarcastic, and I find it really interesting. So I'm learning a lot.
You know, I was going back to something that you said about the South and picking up on the floral. I wanted to talk about the color selection in your exhibition because that's something that also grabs people. The lavender that's in Refuge. Can you talk a little bit about the color selections for those two galleries? And I want to say there was a South Carolina connection to that lavender one. I can't remember, though, when we were planning the show.
So when I started, when I became sought after, I mean, for lack of a better word, or expression, I kind of realized that I was showing the same work in multiple or similar places, but across the country. And then, and being a living artist, that makes it very interesting because you can do things that other people, dead people can do, right? So I thought, okay, what are some of my inspirations for my artwork? And the inlay work that is predominant in South Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East came to mind because I am fascinated by those craftspeople who kind of carved and then inserted beautiful, stones and tiles into it. And usually it was marble, and marble is not easy to carve, so it's a lot of work. And so that was the reason why I started using color to, kind of envelop us. And color does some really interesting things. It can bring you closer, or it can make you, further away. So at the Jewel Collins Museum last fall, I painted the walls deep black. And the shadows still fell on black walls. And I find that so fascinating. Like, color can do so many amazing things. And secondly, amethyst is my birthstone.
Oh,
so the lavender, the lavender came from there. And then the pink was for Carolina, for South Carolina.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
And I was just like, I wanted to do like a flamenco pink.
Yes.
And I thought, and one of my biggest inspirations is Matisse. I look at his work and his color sense all the time, and I've learned so much from him. And so I wanted to do something that would be kind of bounce off each other. So the turquoise of the cube and the pink of the walls kind of clash, but they also create this warmth. And then Valentine was just around the corner.
It was perfect. It was perfect. We had a lot of fun choosing those colors. We gave you the entire swatch book and said, just whatever color you want. We had a lot of fun planning that.
Yeah. But if you notice, the two pieces are really contradictions in terms. One is on the ground, one is levitating. One is open-ended, the other is dense. One is, they are both made of steel, but the perforations in the refuge piece are bigger. In the flower piece, they are like really tiny, and they both do amazing things. And when they overlap, they also do amazing things. And for the refuge, this is like possibly the second or third time I've used two light sources to create overlapping shadows. Because I think the metaphor for shadows, like you were saying, are so important. It's trying to understand somebody else and not really understanding them. So you kind of take a vignette of them and walk away thinking that this person is this way. But we are not single stories.
Right.
We are multi-dimensional people. And so I think that is one of my real desires, to create work that is metaphoric in that sense. And it creates layers. So if you're interested, you can look and find meaning Or you can just look at the beauty and walk away and think of it like, it's a box.
On that note, Let a Million Flowers Bloom is how we named this exhibition. And I just think it's very appropriate to sort of end on that note, because we chose that title because you wanted it to be a wish for the world.
Yeah.
And what is that wish? What do you want to carry forward?
Well, with so many people dying across the world, last year my own older sister passed away. And it's just heartbreaking to realize the loss that we are feeling all around the world because of the pandemic, because of the isolation. And so the reason why I chose pink was because we need hope. We need to rejuvenate our world again. We need to take care of it. We need to leave something better for our future generations. And, before you guys ask me, so you're using steel. Well, it can be melted. In the future, once I'm gone and it's no longer valuable, then it can be melted and reused for something else. And so that was my thought of thinking about creating something hopeful, something warm and blushing and, life.
I love it. Yeah. Anila, thank you so much. I love that, blushing. I haven't heard that one in a while. We wanted to save some time to do some question and answers. It's so fortunate for us to have a living artist in the house, especially one like Anila. And so we wanted to open up the floor for some questions. If anyone has just got some burning curiosity, I've got some standby questions in case you're shy.
I've got a mic for you over here.
And Wilson's got a microphone. Miss Waters. I've got Miss Waters right here in the front.
Sarah, saw your hand go up.
Oh, sorry about that.
Thank you so much. I'm just shocked by your vision. Shocked also by the phrase that somebody used as you described, that something can be too beautiful. That's almost offensive in saying it, really. And also the shading. I'll talk with you later if I can, because I want to get a picture too. 'Cause I have to send it to my old art teacher to let her know I'm still trying to learn. But I'll talk to you more about that. But it's the shadows that I like as well. Outstanding work. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you for sharing. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Miss Waters. Yeah.
Oh, that was just wonderful. Thank you so much. And I've so enjoyed seeing the exhibit and getting to know you. And I look forward to many more conversations with you. And I'm so intrigued with the concept of no exit. Even in philosophy with Jean-Paul Sartre, or that concept that there is no way out. So I see that, or I'm feeling that you see a way out. So can you talk to us a little bit more about how we are going to escape or to get out of our situation that we're now in?
That's really interesting because I think my micro thing is not working very well.
It's the connector.
Oh.
I think you're okay.
So the first refuge piece that I built was 12 feet tall, and it was for outdoors. And I placed it in, it was part of this Biennale in Kansas City. And it had an exit. But the refuge piece came about, and I hope that I can talk about it without offending anybody, because that's not my intent. But during the past regime here in the United States, President Trump said some really not very wonderful things about immigrants. And that made me feel very unhappy, because I felt like, since I've come to this country, I have contributed consistently. And I feel that often immigrants are model citizens because there's a clause in our citizenship that says that if you commit a crime, you're going to be deported. So most immigrants behave impeccably. And so it was really hard on me to understand how somebody who is holding the highest office is saying things like that. So around the same time, I was doing a show with my gallery in Dallas, and I wanted to build a second piece that didn't have an exit. Because the first one did, and you could walk in and sit down and feel the pain of somebody else. But when the border wall started going up, I kind of realized that there's no exit and no entrance. And that's the most important thing. To feel free, you need an exit. And so that was a thought that went into building the refuge without a door for the museum here. So I wonder if I've answered your question, or do I need to elaborate? Yeah.
When we were looking at the slides, I noticed that one of the pieces had a door, and then I wanted to get your perspective on your transition from the being in the womb or in the entrance and then not being able to enter or exit.
It just made me feel like the doors were closing, you know, for so many people. And it just seemed, you know, what's written on the Statue of Liberty is no longer true, is what I felt. And, you know, I personally think the only thing that is beneficial, you know, politicians are the only ones who benefit from this kind of divisiveness. And, you know, if I talk to a Republican on my own, I have a neighbor who came to my party this past weekend, and she believes in a different way of life, and I believe in a different way of life. But we were able to come together and have a glass of wine and be okay. We will always think differently from other people because none of my fingers are the same size. You know, everybody's different. So I often think about that we have to find ways to communicate better, to be able to appreciate people better. I mean, you know, that's life. So.
Thank you.
Anila, I wanted to point out too, the other day we were on a tour with some of the docents, and one of them asked about the idea of being in that space with This Is Not a Refuge. But when you look around, you see all of the shadows of all the people on the walls, and it's almost like you're in the house, even though there's no entrance or no exit.
Exactly. Yes.
Which was a really beautiful notion.
So is that a statement or a question?
That was a statement, but I really love that idea. So what do you think about that really is, I guess, the question.
I think that is true because, you know, when I made that first cube, I was really interested in thinking about like how the audience member is going to be itinerant around it, around that space. And so constantly, without my having to put a motor in the cube and make it turn around, the people are doing that for me. And it's an old-fashioned way of doing an artwork now that we are blessed with so much technology. But I think there's something really unique and quite wonderful to be able to realize that old methodologies can still work. So it's also about, like, you know, not eschewing tradition, yet renewing tradition to fit the new paradigm. And that's what I am eager to explore every time I make something new. I am very interested in using technology, but also using my own sensibilities. one of my favorite artists is Ellsworth Kelly, and he's an American hero, I would say. I hope everybody knows about him. He's another one of my biggest inspirations, but his work is so elegant. And I often think, how do I want to make my work stand? The stillness is what I'm looking for. It's elegant. If I were doing a gimmicky thing, and I have done gimmicky things, I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm fascinated by technology, but also the idea of like, if I keep it still, people will stay still and yet walk around and think. It slows time down, I think, personally for me. And so that's why so I don't know if I
Thank you, Anila. We'll take a few more questions, just to be mindful that to get you down in the galleries to see the exhibition as well.
It's all yours, ma'am. I'll go over there next.
Thank you so much for being here and for all of you for putting this on tonight. This has been wonderful. I was curious about your creative process, the actual formation of making the cubes. In my experience, I've done a lot of painting, artwork. I've done some 3D stuff, but I'm curious as to how you translate your idea of patterns that you spoke about so eloquently into the actual physicality of the cube.
That's hard. Are you a professor? Because I had experienced the architecture in South Asia with the light coming in and going out, I knew that although the thickness of the marble was about an inch, maybe an inch and a half, so the light only traveled straight. It didn't kind of do the corners or, diagonally. So if you look at my sculptures, they are 1/8 of an inch thick. And it's because I want the light to travel in all directions. But because I was familiar with pattern since I was a little girl, and Pakistan is a country that produced cotton, and it had a huge industry for textiles and both woven as well as knitted textiles with patterns on them and jacquards and everything. A lot of stuff that was sold in the 80s here in the US often was made in Pakistan. So or some of it was made, I don't know, really. I shouldn't say that. But I knew that pattern can have an extension or has a presence that's going to get distorted as it goes further and further out. And if you look at the sun and the shade that trees create, like different parts of the day, the shadows are different sized. And I'm the kind of person who walks with my head down so I can look at my shadow as it's walking around when I go for a walk. So it sort of was almost like intuitive in a way to kind of realize that this is possible. And I think convincing my engineer, who I was working with initially, was the hard part, because he often said, well, how do you know this is going to work? And I'm like, it's, how do you say, what's that song? It's a wish or it's a prayer?
A wing and a wing?
Wing and a prayer. I was winging it.
Yes. Yeah, have some faith and just go with it.
So I kind of winged it the first time, and then the learnings I took from that helped me to make the second piece. And I kind of work between the density and the openness. And I often like to create shapes within shapes that are hidden unless you pay attention. So the recent piece that I did that was exhibited at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art in Fort Worth, Texas, it has a cross in it, a square, a circle, and a diamond in it. and it's all hidden unless you pay attention to it. And I find it fascinating because I think to myself, Patton has this ability to do all these things, and yet we eschewed it for a century, almost a century in education because it was considered women's work. And so that's what I find fascinating, that it has a life of its own. So I direct it, but then I let the thing to happen itself. And a lot of it is intuition too, I think. Mm-hmm.
I think we had one more question. Scott.
I'm over here with the mic here.
Oh, okay. We'll take there and then jump up to Scott.
You actually expressed and pre-expressed my comment. I've learned so much tonight, especially about unity. My observation is, how a cube can unfold into a cross. So it's basically the same thing expressed differently. And thank you for that.
Sure, my pleasure.
All right, thank you.
We'll come to you, Scott.
That was a pleasure, just a real treat. I have to confess that I'm a huge fan. I've followed your work for years, and I'm thrilled to see you in person. I'm from Houston originally, and I've seen some of your work at the Rice Gallery back when you had an installation at Rice. And part of the the experience of seeing your work installed here reminded me very much of the Rothko Chapel, right, in Houston. And you spoke of stillness and whispers. And I guess my question is sort of about permanence and impermanence. I mean, the Rothko Chapel and the Alhambra, for example, these are, permanent installations, right? I mean, they're durational works that will go on for hundreds of years, generations, whatever. Do people approach you and ask you about like a permanent installation? And I confess I don't know how long some of the pieces that we saw on the screens today, are installed. But, your work is about light and shadow and change. And, the reference to textiles and stuff is sort of about, these are basically temporary, objects of incredible beauty. But, at the same time, there is this, your references are to these sort of longer lasting, permanent structures. And so I just wondered, do you wake at night dreaming of like a permanent installation that somebody 300 years will see and go, holy shit? Or do you, what I'm saying? Like, do you appreciate the temporality of like a moving exhibition where it shows in Fort Worth, it shows in Columbia, it shows somewhere else? And the, way that plays out in terms of like the way you conceptualize
So I have
light.
a design for Storm King already in my head. You're so right. There are two permanent installations so far. One is at the Peabody Essex, and they've had that piece up for since 2017 now. And the only thing I said to them was, no yoga with naked bodies. No downward dog allowed. Otherwise, they can do whatever they want in there. Can you imagine, right?
I can.
But other than that, I have a permanent installation at a mall in Chicago. You probably remember the red piece on the blue background. So I also designed the mural for it. And when I went to do the site visit there, I was like, there are so many big signs around. I gotta make my work louder than everything else around here. And so when I proposed the mural to go with the cube that was hanging under the elevator, it's at the entrance of this mall. The people who were, collecting, they came back and said, can she lower the volume on the colors? I said, you hired me, trust me. I know what I'm doing. And that's often something that, outside of artists, I think people have a lot of concerns. And they don't realize that we look at everything. We think about the audience, we think about how we're going to place the work, install it, all of the rest of it. And so I held to my guns. I said, no, you don't want me, I'll walk away. But this is what I'm going to do. And so red and blue it was, and it sticks out. And there's a Mama and Me, and a Nordstrom rack, and Neiman Marcus, and they all pale. And that's like, so those are the two permanent installations so far. They're Chrysler Museum and Cincinnati Museum own my sculptures. And I am working on two public art projects right now. One is going to be in a foreign country, and the other is in California. So let's hope that it comes through. Yeah. Yes?
We lived in Toledo for 30 years, so we're very familiar with the museum, and I was noticing where everything was, and you had at least 3 installations there. Are they long-term, or?
It was a show, and then they held one of the pieces up for another year. And that's what's been happening over the last, I think, decade, that usually the exhibitions are extended, or the museum would request an extension to one of the pieces, so because it brings in a lot of people and they're able to kind of create community, which is really a wonderful byproduct of my work. Thank you.
I'm watching our time, Anila, because we could just really have so many questions and more conversation. I just wanted to also mention that Anila is going to do a public talk tomorrow at 2:00, and we're going to explore some of the same themes, maybe go into some other areas. I heard some really great questions tonight that I think I'd like to incorporate into tomorrow's talk. So that's tomorrow at 2:00. She also did a binder podcast for us. So if you really would love to share some of this, go to the Binder podcast. You can hear more about some of what we talked about tonight. And then we've got a lot of really good programming coming up associated with this exhibition. We are going to do some meditation practice in the galleries, so to kind of tap into that reflection a little bit with your work. So,
I want to add that for the refuge piece, there's a sound component.
Yes.
That is quite beautiful, and it's immigrant voices that we collected. I hired a young man who did the interviews and everything, and he compiled it into a beautiful lilting, sort of like soundtrack that if you're interested, you can find it on the website. That'll link to my website, and you can hear it yourselves. It starts with coming to America and how you find America and what happens. And there are parts of it that's slightly sad, but most of it is really like exciting.
It's very enlightening.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you all again for being here tonight. Anila, thank you.
Thank you.